Today's featured speaker is Joseph M. Adelman. He is an associate professor in the history department at Framingham State University in Framingham, Massachusetts. He is a historian of media, communication, and politics in the Atlantic world. His first book, entitled Revolutionary Networks, The Business and Politics of Printing the News, 1763 to 1789, was published by the Johns Hopkins University Press in 2019. He is now at work on a history of the post office in America. Adelman earned his bachelor's degree in history from Harvard University and a master's and PhD in history from the Johns Hopkins University. He was previously a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow at the American Antiquarian Society, a postdoctoral fellow in the program in Early American Economy and Society at the Library Company of Philadelphia, and served as a lecturer in the history department at Johns Hopkins University. In addition, he has worked as communications director to a member of the New York State Assembly and as a consultant for the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities. He has held fellowships and grants from the American Antiquarian Society, the American Philosophical Society, the Gilder Lehrman Institute for American History, and the Library Company of Philadelphia, among others. He has presented and published broadly, including in the journals Enterprise and Society and Early American Studies, TheAtlantic.com, Bloomberg, and as a blogger at the Junto. He also serves as the assistant editor for digital initiatives at the Amehanjoro Institute of American History and Culture, where he edits the Octo and is an assistant producer for the Ben Franklin's World podcast. Please join me in welcoming Professor Adelman.
Thank you, Patrick, for that introduction and also for inviting me. I don't know if you saw, but Rob is here tonight for so he got his shout out for next week, and that sounds like a fantastic topic. So I hope people come back next week.
I did know he was on, yes. I gave him a heads up that I'd be plugging his presentation.
There we go. So as Patrick mentioned, I did spend 2 years after college working for the New York State Assembly, one of which I spent living in Albany. So this would have been a homecoming of sorts. I spent a year living in a tiny little apartment on State Street, not far from the Capitol. So it would have been nice to have actually been able to be with you all in person for many reasons, not least of which getting to come back and see some old places. But I do see some familiar faces or some familiar names on the list. So that is nice. And the exhibit, from what I've been able to see from afar, looks fantastic. So if you are up to braving the COVID rules, I think you'll enjoy it quite a lot if you can get in to look at the actual physical exhibit in Albany. What I want to do tonight is start with the national story because it sets the context, and then zoom in a little bit closer into New York State. The other part of my background is I grew up in Westchester County, so I'm a born and bred New Yorker, exiled in Boston. It's a sad existence. So I have some familiarity with New York politics in the contemporary vein, and some of the parallels are amusing to see how long back the patterns go. I'm going to share my screen so that we can do that. First, I forgot I had done this, but I put a slide up of DeWitt Clinton, about whom I won't be speaking a whole lot this evening, but I figured since it's his collection of broadsides that brings us virtually together this evening, it's worth taking a look at him. I'm happy to talk and answer questions about him later, but at least take a look. So not knowing exactly what everyone's background knowledge is, I want to just give some really basics on how we end up with the political parties we end up with in the 1790s, the Federalists and the Republicans. So the first thing I'd say is that coming out of the Revolution, the basic political philosophy that's broadly agreed upon by most of the revolutionaries is one in which parties are bad. They are private interests and therefore automatically corrupting of the public interest. So when the framers get to Philadelphia in 1787 and they're crafting a government, they craft a government without parties. The Constitution makes no mention of parties. It makes, if you read through the actual 7 articles, it makes no accommodation for a partisan structure, either like we have now or really like anything that's existed in American history. And it's ironic in a way, because everybody in American politics in 1787 was familiar with parties and certainly with partisan inclinations. They had seen news from England of the Whigs and the Tories and the court party and the country party, and they had a sense of that, and that's actually part of what steered them away from it. But in their own colonies and then in their own states, and good Lord, in New York State, they had been familiar with partisan affiliation, if not something that they would call parties, for quite some time. So the Constitution is designed without parties in mind, and of course, then within 5 or 6 years, they've begun to form parties. So I gave you the 2 figureheads of the movement on the one side of the screen. On the Federalist side is our New York friend Alexander Hamilton. The Federalists tended to be pro-Constitution. They were in favor of a stronger central government. They tended to support, or at least a Hamiltonian vision supported, a very commercially oriented republic and passing laws and creating a government structure that would support merchants, support commerce. And this is a piece we'll come back to later, in the debate, not the debate, it's a war between Britain and France in the 1790s. The Federalists tend to be pro-Britain. They want the United States positioned independently of Britain. Hamilton and others, they fought in the Revolution. They didn't want to go backwards that way, but they saw Britain as America's cousin and closest ally, or thought it should be the closest ally. On the other hand are the Republicans, whose leader of sorts is Thomas Jefferson. They tended to be more suspicious about a centralized government. So most of the people in 1787, 1788 who oppose the Constitution end up drifting over towards the Democratic Republicans. They're a little more suspicious. They're a little less excited about the prospect of centralized government in a faraway city. And they would have considered first New York and then Philadelphia and then eventually Washington as too far away from the people. They also tended to be more comfortable with what the United States was at the time, which was an agricultural nation with some commerce. And to the extent that they supported commerce, they tended to lean towards France as an ally and trading partner, as opposed to Britain. At the very outset of the French Revolution in 1789, most Americans were supportive of it. Once blood starts running in the streets, the Federalists get nervous. And the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson has some wild quotes, but he has some quote about watering the tree of liberty with the blood of tyrants. They tend to side with France, with the side of liberty, with the side of republics, over Britain, with whom Americans are more familiar. And having said all of that, in the 1790s, political affiliations are very fluid. The issues are very nascent. They're still developing. The affiliations are still developing. People sort of float back and forth. And actually, DeWitt Clinton is one of that kind of person. He works for his uncle, George Clinton, who's a Republican. He ends up running for president as a Federalist. That people are floating around. It's not nearly as well formed as it is certainly today or even later in American history. But that gives you the basic idea. So that's one piece of the puzzle, is our politicians. Now, the point of the talk is to talk about print and partisanship. And that's because what partisanship develops through Federalists and Republicans happens largely through printing offices and through the news. So printers in early America tend to have a bunch of jobs all collected under that one title. So they tend to be the proprietors of a printing office, where they're running a printing press. So they're physically operating the press with their employees, their artisans, any journeymen they hire. They are often editing, certainly their newspaper, and sometimes they're almanacs and some other publications. They're running the business. They're running a household. They're head of a household, and the wife of a printer is a very important person. The apprentices live with the master printer, and so are part of the extended family. So they're running that. They sometimes act as what we would describe as the publisher, as the financial backing for a publication. Though they also publish, if somebody walks in and offers them money to publish something, they will rarely say no. So they publish all sorts of things. I'm going to talk about the broadsides later when I have some of the images from the DeWitt Clinton collection up on a later slide. They do what we call job printing, which is essentially using the printing office as a Kinko's. I have this text and I'd like 500 copies, please. They run off pre-printed forms for mortgages and indentures and commercial transactions, things like that. They very popularly publish almanacs, which if you've never seen, we're not going to talk much about them today, though there is politics in the almanacs that maybe we could talk about during the Q&A a little bit. But this is just an example of one, and almost everybody bought an almanac. So there's something that every printing office would have published either on their own or in coordination with other printers. And then, and this is the part where my expertise comes in, they printed newspapers, and I had a lot of fun animating that slide when I made it. So I hope you enjoyed that too. Got to get my little Batman whirling newspapers in. Newspapers in the post-revolutionary era are important because they're the backbone of political parties. They form, through their editors and printers, a series of networks that make the partisan arguments flow around the country. And what I'd say just as a first thing is that the Republicans tended to be better at it, the Jeffersonian Republicans. They tended to be more interested in public opinion and in both responding to and generating public opinion. Federalists, as part of their vision, tended to be a little less eager for consistent public opinion. They were okay with people voting, but then wanted to be allowed to rule. So they're a little behind the curve on creating these newspaper networks. And that's aided and aids a vast expansion of news and newspapers in the United States. So two things are happening with printing as a trade, as a business, after the revolution. So the first is that it's expanding geographically. Before the revolution, during the late colonial era, it was almost exclusively right along the coast, right along the Post Road, what today is US 1. There were some newspapers in the interior. Albany had one in the mid 1770s for a few years. The printers were loyalists, so they left when the revolution started. And it wasn't until after the revolution that they got another one. But after the revolution, the trade expands geographically. People move with white Americans as they're expanding further away from the coast. In New York, up the Hudson River to Kingston, to Fishkill, to Poughkeepsie, to Hudson, to Albany. And then starting to go further west into Western Pennsylvania, into Ohio, into Kentucky, into all the places that white Americans are beginning to expand. And so that is one thing that's happening. The other thing that's happening, and this is the New York City part of the story, is that the trade is just expanding in size and competition and becoming something different. Those jobs that I explained to you a minute ago that all come under the umbrella of the printer are starting to separate in the biggest cities as the market for print and for news gets bigger. So New York City and Philadelphia and Boston have tons of competition. By the 1780s, there are daily newspapers. Before that, almost all newspapers were weekly. They had specialized newspapers. New York City had essentially financial newspapers, commercial papers that were not publishing all the news, but would simply publish news of commerce, news of stock prices, of prices of goods, and things like that, because New York was becoming a large enough financial market and commercial market to support that kind of work. And then the trade's beginning to divide out. So there's enough work to do that instead of the one man or two partners running an office together who are running the physical operation of the shop and also running the business and financing the operation and also editing the newspaper, those jobs are starting to separate out, so that the printer, what we call the printer, is the person who physically operates the press, who sets type, pulls the press. And then the newspaper has a separate editor who is often from a printer is from an artisanal background. He's a laborer. After the revolution, they are pretty much all literate and are interacting with the high levels of society, but they are coming from an artisanal background. They're coming from a laboring person's background who does physical work. These new newspaper editors, some of them are from that background, some of them come from somewhat more literary backgrounds. So some of the first newspapers, national newspapers, Philip Freneau becomes an editor of a Republican newspaper in Philadelphia, whose name is, of course, escaping me, but he was the Princeton roommate of James Madison. And Madison brings him on to edit the national Republican paper in the mid 1790s. So those jobs are starting to change, and that shapes how the trade is working. That shapes how partisanship works in the press, and it shapes what's happening in New York State, which had, even in the colonial era, a really competitive market compared to other towns. By 1775, there were half a dozen or so newspapers published in New York City, which is one of the largest single city concentrations in the colonies. The only other ones that had anything close to that number are Boston and Philadelphia. That stayed pretty stable. In fact, it dropped during the war because the British Army occupied New York City from the fall of 1776 all the way until news of the peace treaty arrived in the fall of 1783. And so Patriot printers left town. They went up the Hudson and printed in Fishkill and Poughkeepsie and Kingston. And I'm just hoping all of you know where I'm just assuming that within all the audience, people know where those are and that I can just feel comfortable and say the names. So they head up the Hudson towards safer places like that. The New York colonial and then state legislature is meeting in those towns. And so they're following that so they can try and get some government business while they're printing and trying to stay close to the government for their newspapers. And then at the end of the war, a couple of the loyalists actually stay in town. And it's not as central to this story because it's not really DeWitt Clinton's thing, but I'm happy to tell the story of the loyalist printers if anybody wants in the Q&A. And the Patriots come back and it becomes far more competitive. So in 1783, New York State, the entire state has 10 newspapers and 8 of them are in New York City. By 1800, so just 15, 17 years later, there's 34 newspapers being published in New York State. And I think well over a dozen of those are in New York City. So there's lots of competition. There's lots of space as New York City is growing in size and power. There's battles over printing work, not just the newspaper, but the government work. That's one of the ways that printers can help guarantee support for themselves, is if they have a government contract. Newspapers are great. They get your name and your product out every single week. Subscribers aren't good at paying for it though. So it's hard to make money as a newspaper printer. You can make some money selling an almanac, sure, but that's if they're sold for half a penny each, which without even translating in terms of translating the amount of money, that's a very, very small amount of money, right, on a per sale basis. You'd have to, there's no way you can sell enough almanacs to finance your whole business. And so you need something that people will actually pay for, and the government will actually pay on its contracts. And so that's a very competitive thing. So the state printer who had been in Fishkill was a man named John Holt, who came back and set up his newspaper again, the New York Journal, in New York, and then died about 6 weeks later. And his wife actually took on the editorship of the newspaper, the position as master of the printing office, and his job as state printer. So she added the New York State logo to the newspaper to say, this is my job, come and get it. And held that for about a year until she was outmaneuvered and sort of forced into retirement. But that's something that contract then goes through, and often it's spread among a number of printers in New York City when the capital's there, and then later in Albany. In the late 1780s, printers tend to be very much nationalists. They are thinking in a very broad kind of way. So they tend to be very supportive of the new Constitution. Most of the printers in the United States were supporters of the Constitution. There were a few who were anti-federalists, and they faced some difficulty. Obviously, New York City is where the original Federalist essays, all 85 of them, were published, and 3 New York City papers are the only ones that actually stuck with it and published all 85. I forget exactly when the last other newspaper gave up, but the last 30 or 35 or so, Hamilton and Madison were basically writing for themselves and some people in New York City. Nobody, the first couple of essays were widely reprinted around the United States, and then it just sort of constricts down to those 3 New York City papers by the end. Printers did face violence for their partisan inclinations, especially during the ratification debate. The anti-federalists, the people who were opposed to the Constitution, one of the leaders of that group was a man named Thomas Greenleaf, who actually took over from Elizabeth Holt, took over the New York Journal from the Holt family. And his house was attacked and his printing office attacked on the night that New York ratified the Constitution in July of 1788. But he worked very hard, and 5 days later had his newspaper back in production. So this sets the stage for where partisanship is mostly happening, certainly on a national level. The way that these stories circulate is the printers are getting copies of newspapers from other places. So Porcupine's Gazette, is a Federalist paper in Philadelphia, would be getting the Worcester Intelligencer and would check and see if there was anything from central Massachusetts that was of interest this week. They would have a journeyman or an apprentice reset the type of that article, that paragraph, and put it in their newspaper. And they could do that because the post office was set up to circulate news. It was set up with very, very favorable rates for sending newspapers and very high rates for sending what we now call first-class mail, for sending letters. Personal correspondence was relatively expensive. Sending newspapers was relatively cheap. So it was the way it served as a sort of Associated Press, an aggregator or a wire service for news circulation. And the Republicans used that to great advantage to build a network of printers and editors who were of like mind, who would take news stories written from their perspective and reprint them around, right? It'd be in Philadelphia, maybe in the Aurora, and then it would be a few weeks later in Hudson and in Boston and down in Charleston and Williamsburg, and places all around the United, and out to Cincinnati or Lexington, Kentucky, all around the country. And that's a lot of what is going on. And the DeWitt Clinton collection has some of those, but a lot of what it has are actually broadsides. I think the next is, the next slide is to give you a little background on New York's politics. We'll get to broadsides in a second. I apologize for mixing up my slides. So the same kind of similar kind of dynamics. New York, the colony, and then the state have very complicated politics related to the patroonships, related to rival factions in New York City. In the 1790s, some of the bigger figures include George Clinton, who is the funkiest of the Republicans and the first governor of New York State, and a major figure in the Republican Party, who is the uncle of the DeWitt Clinton who collected these broadsides. We have John Jay, who's my fellow Westchester person, is among the leaders of the Federalists, serves as Chief Justice and an ambassador, and as the second governor, which we'll talk about in a second with some of these broadsides. I want to zoom in. What I'm going to do now is sort of talk about the local political context and use some of these actual broadsides from the collection, which I'm very grateful to Patrick for going through the exhibit and taking some photographs of, so that I was able to talk about them in some more detail. And the first couple, or actually most of them, now think about it, relate to the Jay Treaty, to a treaty negotiated by John Jay. So in 1793, as background, George Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality, essentially trying to keep the United States out of what was then the beginning of what would be a 20-year war between Britain and France. However, even with that declaration of neutrality, the United States faced a number of challenges. Both France and Britain were trying to intercept, American shipping to the other set of ports. They were just harassing ships otherwise. The British, and especially, were impressing sailors. They were forcing American sailors off of their ships, claiming that they were British runaways and forcing them to join the British Navy. So Washington sends John Jay in 1794, while he is still Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It was a less busy job then than it is now, as an ambassador to negotiate with the British. Jay had been one of the negotiators of the Peace of Paris in 1783. He had extensive experience in foreign affairs, and the Supreme Court apparently wasn't that busy. So in late 1794, Jay and the rest of the American Party agree to a treaty that was intended to try and solve some of these problems, to improve the trading relationship, to get the British out of forts in the Great Lakes region, Fort Niagara, right up western New York, Detroit, Michigan, those areas, to get the British to actually abandon those forts, which they had agreed to in the initial peace treaty and had never done. And then was not able to get the British to agree not to impress sailors, but felt good nonetheless about the treaty. The treaty became enormously controversial when it got back to the United States. At first, because Washington argued that the treaty text should be kept secret while the Senate deliberated on whether to ratify it. Then because the text leaked and was published, and then because Republicans essentially freaked out because they were worried about creating these closer ties with Britain. So it turns into this very hotly contested treaty that hits into a lot of issues that partly relate in New York to theories about public opinion. Hamilton wrote extensively about why the Jay Treaty should be ratified despite public opposition, because public opposition didn't matter. The people weren't smart enough to know what to do. He's also an ally of Jay. He's very, very pro-British once he stopped shooting at them. And Democratic Republicans are opposed to that. The treaty does eventually get ratified. So let's take a look at how this plays out, because one of the things that happens as part of this is when Jay is getting on the ship to return to New York, he's also a candidate for governor in the 1795 gubernatorial election. And so these broadsides that are part of, there we go. Broadsides can encompass a whole range of things. So a newspaper looks roughly like what it looks like today. Is usually 4 pages. It's folded. You open it, you read it. These broadsides, sometimes they're also called handbills. It depends on exactly the size and what the intention is. They're almost always printed only on one sheet of paper and only on one side, so they can be posted up. And actually, this one I don't know exactly because I've only ever looked at the photograph, but you can almost see in the corners there's either wax. There's something that's either been sealed or pasted up on a wall. For people to read, for people to see quickly, for people to be able to get a sense of what's going on. So in 1795, John Jay is Federalist candidate for governor against George Clinton. This particular broadside is this one of the Ulster one? No, this is one from New York State. From New York City, excuse me, essentially arguing it's okay that Jay hasn't come back. because he'll be back in time to take office on July 1st. Even if he's not here on election day, don't worry, you can still vote for him because he'll be here in time. Signed by Nicholas Kruger and 2 other New Yorkers. Kruger's a leading New York City merchant and Federalist and a mentor to Hamilton. So this would essentially have been a message to various, when they say electors, they mean the voters, men who met the property requirement to vote in New York State, trying to reassure them that Jay would be back, which there presumably would be a paired argument floating around against that. Another thing that these broadsides are useful for in print is to reinforce community ties. So one of the most common uses is these sorts of subscription lists. So you could take a look and read the list if you've got ancestors from Ulster County and look for your favorite ancestor or street names or various things. But they would print off these kinds of lists. They would handwrite them sometimes, but if you wanted to be able to spread them out more, right, you need the duplication of print. That in this case would serve the purpose of essentially an endorsement of Jay and Stephen Van Rensselaer as a gubernatorial and lieutenant governor ticket, where the idea would be that you could post this, you could pass this around, you could see your neighbor's name, see some prominent person's name who you trust, and get an endorsement. So they're operating in actually much the same way as endorsements would now, and are another common type. This is, I'm going a little quickly because the last of these is the one that's the most interesting, and I want to do some really close work with that one. This is from 1798 when Robert R. Livingston, and if you don't know the Livingstons, the R also stands for Robert. So he's Robert Livingston, who's nominated as a Republican to run against Jay when he's up for re-election. At that point, they had 3-year terms. And so this is simply a meeting notice, essentially, to notify people that Livingston was nominated, then to request people to vote for Livingston. That, again, you could hand out, you could pass around. I want to talk about this last one of the 4 that Patrick was kind enough to send me, and go into some depth. Because as I was reading this, it's just fascinating text. And it also, it helps us, it's actually essentially an 18th century attack ad. So you can, I hope, see the top: crisis to the people of the state of New York, war, war, war. And then a gigantic block of text in the end, no war, no bloodshed. So what is going on with this? So in the 3 years between 1795 and 1798, things had gotten worse, particularly with France. Washington retired. John Adams became the president. I'm trying not to sing Act 2 of Hamilton, which floats through my head whenever I talk about this. And by 1798, the United States is this close to war with France, as part of what then was still the French Revolutionary Wars of the 1790s. Jay, as a Federalist, was a supporter of Adams, was a supporter of the Federalist line of leaning more towards Britain, and had been the one who negotiated the treaty that, even though the United States claimed neutrality, pushed the United States a little closer towards Britain. So Republicans have a ton of animosity for that because they still support France. They still want the United States to be on the French side, and they certainly don't want the United States going to war against France. So this broadside captures all of that in what essentially is a very, very long and verbose attack ad. So to show that to you, I did something I would do in my teaching normally. Pull out a pencil and paper and let's get ready to take some notes and talk about this, and highlight some actual quotes from this to show you what they're doing with these broadsides, how closely they expect people to read them, and how they're fighting over it. So this is a pro-Livingston, anti-Jay broadside. So the first, I'm going to use that. First quote is from the beginning, is the anonymous author saying, no, it's not anonymous. No, it is anonymous, sorry. Conflated a couple of them in my head. Let me call to your mind, but too recently, Our burning cities, ravished wives and daughters, scalped infants, desolated fields, strewed with promiscuous dead of sire and son, slain by the unrelenting hand of Britain and her savage allies. I repeat it, pause for a while and view this bloody scene through which you lately passed to establish your freedom and independence against British attempts to oppose on you stamp acts, tea duties, and a right to bind you in all cases whatsoever. So this is what's happening here is that New York state politics are getting very nationalized, and whether he likes it or not, it's all John Jay's fault because he was in England and negotiated this treaty. But this is a very common particular feature of New York state and broader United States politics in the 1790s of trying to use the legacy and memory of the American Revolution as a political weapon. So both Federalists and Republicans are making these claims of we are the true heirs of 1776. And this is the most horrid way you could describe it of remember our cities being burned, remember our wives and daughters being attacked, our children, our fields, right? All of this sort of visceral imagery of destruction. And then on top of that, a remembrance of the legal and political debates about the Stamp Act, about the Tea Act. And this reference to bind you in all cases whatsoever is not something that we necessarily click into, but they would have in the 1790s. That phrase, in all cases whatsoever, appears in the Declaration of Independence in 1776, that Parliament had claimed the right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. And that's because that same four-word phrase appeared in the Parliamentary Act of 1766, called the Declaratory Act at the end of the Stamp Act crisis, when Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but said, we also declare that we have the right to legislate in all cases whatsoever. So it's a very clear signal to anybody who remembers 1776, to anyone who's read the Declaration of Independence, that this is, the British were bad guys. How could you possibly support the British? And to this point, the anonymous author has not brought up, even a little bit, John Jay. They go on. As you seem to have forgot, whatever ought to be remembered by Columbia's sons and daughters, permit me, least I may thought to trifle at this awful crisis, to instance in the late cruel war with Britain the burning of various towns, Charlestown, whoever did this likes coastal Connecticut, New London, Fairfield, Norwalk, Danbury, Esopus. This is how they spelled Schoharie. Bear witness to our butchered daughter McCrae. Jane McCrae was a woman who actually, her husband was a British soldier, an American loyalist who joined the British Army, who they claimed was murdered by Native Americans, and became in death a cause célèbre of the alleged savagery of Native Americans, and a symbol of the war and a justification then for attacks on Native Americans for decades after that. So blood, oh guiltless blood like this, could only quench the thirst of Britain for daring to oppose her unjust impositions on our undefending country. We're almost 2/3 of the way through the broadside, by the way. No mention of Jay at all. Until now. So with that very government of Britain, the source of all those evils, Mr. Jay has made a treaty, and it's his fault we're about to go to France. It's his fault that, believe it or not, the United States Congress has passed a Stamp Act. It's your fault that there's new property taxes, new quit rents, and all the other evils of a public nature that now distress the land. He's advocating for war with France. He's advocating for the Stamp Act. If you prefer the blessings of peace, though, vote for Mr. Livingston, who's opposed to war, the Stamp Act, a measure that began it with Britain, and to every other measure, which leads to its horrid consequences in this once so truly envious, prosperous, and happy country. And so I'm going to back up just a step so you can actually see this broadside again. This would have been posted in public places. This would have been passed around. Unfortunately, I looked this up in the database of early American imprints, and it does not say exactly where it was printed. As a historian, I am well versed in these texts. Someone who is a specialist in the paper, in the print, might actually be able to identify the printer, but they haven't to this point. So we don't know exactly where in New York State it would have been published. but this would have been handed around. And these sorts of broadsides, of which they are plentiful in the Clinton collection, help us to see what kinds of local context there are for politics. This is the kind of print, especially that local people would have seen. This would not have necessarily circulated to other states. Right? Nobody in South Carolina cares about this argument about who you should vote for governor of New York, unless it's in the newspaper itself. And so it's a different side of politics that we can see. On the one hand, the newspapers are circulating around, and if you go to the exhibit, there's at least a couple of examples of those. That those are circulating. They're making these local cases. They're discussing legislation. They're discussing campaigns. But this is what locals in New York would have especially been treated to in terms of arguments, in terms of political campaigns, spread beyond local, but spread beyond just the immediate context of someone's voice. So that sort of brings us back around. This is Thomas Greenleaf's, he eventually changed it. This is now the New York Journal and Patriotic Register. I just pulled for you, there was nothing in particular I wanted to show you, just needed a good newspaper image, and July 4th seemed like a good time to put it. So this collection, all of these kinds of print objects and something like the DeWitt Clinton collection are really important for helping us understand politics in the early American Republic and in New York State especially. It helps us see the national networks at play. It helps us see the ways in which even local and state elections get drawn into these national debates. Sometimes the issues are very localized. Sometimes they get nationalized, and that happens still to this day. And at the same time, we see the national and the localized nature of politics, which still for many voters is operating on a very personal level. What's happening in Philadelphia, what's eventually happening in Washington is sort of abstracted. Even what's happening in Albany, if you live in one of the small Hudson River towns or west along the Mohawk, those debates are abstracted, and so bringing them home and engaging with them directly is this is the way that you would have done that. So I thank you all. Before I close this up, I always put my contact information. I'm happy to, we'll field some questions now, but I'm also happy to field questions if you have anything you wanted to email me about, or follow me on Twitter and heckle me there, or check out my website.
Well, thank you, Professor Adelman. We do have some questions.
I saw some blinking.
Yep. So Bree or Bria, I'm not sure how she pronounces it, asked, I know that broadsides were still used in the 1860s. When did that form of outreach disappear? And how would you compare broadsides to graffiti in terms of political outreach?
So Bria, thank you for the question. The short answer is they haven't disappeared. In a way, right? Like we still see posters, we still see, I mean, they've evolved into other forms. So, right, I live in Massachusetts, and most of you, I assume, live in New York, and so you probably didn't hear much about the presidential campaign because it was assumed where the electoral votes were going. But during the primary season, I imagine that some of you, like me, were getting leaflets in the mail every couple of days from candidates. There were posters up around town. So it's not that they don't really ever disappear. They evolve into these other forms that we see now. In terms of comparing them between broadsides and graffiti, in terms of outreach, the distinction is really about the reach. Right? Graffiti is a handwritten form of art. You have to be in the place where the graffiti happens in order to see it and interact with its message. Where if I'm printing something, and whether if it's 10 copies or 10,000, right, I then have a whole bunch of other places that I can put it up and show it, and other kinds of audiences I can interact with. I mean, the other thing I'd say about 18th century broadsides is they are 100%, or as close to 100% as possible, text. There's very few images. And so you need to be literate to be able to understand them, but they are, for someone who's textually literate, they are legible. You can understand what the argument is. Graffiti has its own grammar, it has its own form, it has its own, and so if it's a visual form of art that also requires interpretation and requires literacy in interpreting that to be able to actually understand it. Right? If you're not part of whatever in crowd the graffiti is for, it's just paint on a wall.
Rich asked, did printers, publishers, and papers print only their views and agenda, or did they print as mercenaries, printing anything for payment?
That's a great question, and have I got a book for you to read? That's actually one of the big themes of my book. So the answer is yes and yes, depending on who we're talking about, is the short version. The slightly longer version is that printers are constantly managing those various inputs of their commercial interests, and commercial interests to the extent that we can tease them out from any other kinds of interests, their own political interests and agenda, and then the political interest and agenda of the community around them in which they're interacting. So in the colonial era, New York City's different. It's big. New London, Connecticut has one printer, and he can barely survive on the business of New London, Connecticut. If he gets anybody angry, he's out of business, right? If there's two political factions fighting with each other in New London, he has to find a way to stay okay with both of them, or he's just never going to make it. So in those circumstances, in those single printer towns, it doesn't really matter what they think. Their commercial interest is keep everybody happy, and claim at least that you're operating, the term they used was a free and open press. They wanted a press that was free from government interference, from censorship, and they wanted to operate a press that was open to all parties. And so they portrayed themselves as, I'm the printer, I'm the guy who pulls the press, you guys have opinions, I am the public, I provide the public forum that reflects that set of ideas in the public, that are out in the public space. Now, some printers are able to use that. The leading example of this is Benjamin Franklin, where he uses the space that opens up of creating this appearance of neutrality to then publish under pseudonyms all sorts of stuff that actually that presents his political opinion to people. And it's just, well, I'm the printer, and they sent me this really interesting essay that I'm going to print. Sure, I wrote it, but I don't have to put my name on it in the newspaper. So they're managing that, and what you end up with is a spectrum of, in those small towns where there's just one printer, they're pretty much always, they have political opinions like everybody. They're sometimes active, sometimes less active, but they tend to be a little more, aim for a little more equanimity in their publishing. In the bigger cities, in New York City, even before the revolution, but certainly after the revolution, the printing market is big enough that you can be the Federalist printer, or you can be the Republican printer and make it. And so they do start to do that. They start to separate out along partisan lines. And that's something that's really hardened in the 19th century. The 19th century is really known as a era of partisan newspapers. And some of that lives to this day. So, right, the Springfield, Massachusetts newspaper is a Springfield Republican. The Rochester is Rochester Democrat. Right, there was a Rochester Democrat and a Rochester Chronicle, and now they're merged. But right, we see that's still in some of the names of newspapers.
Douglas was wondering about the use of political cartoons that were published. Were there any in newspapers and broadsides, and political cartoonists popular then like some are today?
Not nearly as popular as today, and that's simply because the market's more limited. And it's a great question, and the reason it's more limited is really technological. So to reprint something in another place, every printer has a certain number of sets of type. They have a pile of however many thousand E's and X's, right? They have all the letters. This is as if I have my printing cases set up behind me. Right, and so that that you can pull from a newspaper and reset the type in your own office. Anybody in the country can do that. And all printers have roughly that same skill. Images require, it's a slightly different skill set. It's obviously a more specialized skill set. And it requires a lot more labor. So through the revolution and even into the 19th century, there are not that many images in newspapers. And I'll do broadsides in a second because they're a little different. In newspapers, there's not a lot of images because you'd have to do a lot of work within a week or within 3 days or 2 days to get a woodcut or an engraving done to then put in the press with the type. And so those are pretty rare. The ones that do exist are they're what we today you call stock images. So there's a horse and a ship and a casket. And so when someone dies, you use the casket woodcut and just plop it in until it's worn out. And then somebody does a new one. And the ship you can put on any advertisement for a merchant, right? Things like that are what you see. There are political cartoons. They tend to be a little more for a local market because they require that specialized skill. So people like silversmiths or goldsmiths, people who are metal workers, like Paul Revere in Boston, do sometimes have that engraving skill that they're able to do those kinds of cartoons, either original or copied from British sources. And those are printed actually on a different kind of press. Not to get too technical, but the newspaper is printed, the letters are raised. And so when you push the paper down, the ink is on top of the letters and you push the paper against the type and it pushes the ink from the letters onto the paper. For an engraving, it's the opposite for something and that's the same for a woodcut. Sorry, if you cut wood, you cut out the picture and the picture itself is what's inked and then imprinted onto the paper. For engravings that are like copper, it's the opposite. It's etched into the piece of copper. And then there's a special process where you put the ink on the copper plate and then wipe it away so it's only in the edges of the drawing. And then there's an entirely different kind of press that you run the paper through and the engraving to push the copper and the paper together so that the ink soaks up from the etched in places. So you can't even put them through the same press. It has to happen on two completely different separate processes. Excuse me. Which makes it again more difficult to reproduce those cartoons, but they're then produced for a local market. They just take a little longer, and so they're circulated a little more locally than they are nationally.
Chris asked, what role did broadsides and partisan papers play in generating support for and facilitating communication between political associations like the Democratic Republican clubs that emerged during the 1790s and which some political elites considered treasonous?
That is a great question. And the answer is a huge role. So Democratic Republican clubs are one of the earliest forms of organized political activity in the 1790s in the United States that are organized nationally. And they spring up in opposition to neutrality, in opposition to some of the policies of the Washington administration, and especially Hamilton as Treasury Secretary. And they're considered treasonous by some because there's still a debate in the 1790s about whether political opposition is legitimate. And whether that is, political opposition is something that is opposition to the policies of a particular group of people, or whether it's opposition to established government. If it's the first one, which is what we typically consider political opposition today, then you're fine. You're opposing another group of people's policies and you'd replace them with your policies. If, and this is what comes from the idea of parties being bad, if you're saying, I oppose Hamilton's policies, and it's read as, I oppose the existence of the Treasury Department and the Constitution, well, that's a bigger problem. Then you're declaring your opposition to the entirety of the American government. So that's why they're considered treasonous. But they start to sprout up in opposition to Washington administration policies. and the ways that they're communicating back and forth between towns. They're doing personal correspondence, but they're also linked into newspaper printers and editors and sharing clippings, sharing essays, things like that. So they're really critical for the Democratic Republican clubs.
Gotta unmute myself.
Yep.
So Beth asked, can your book, Revolutionary Networks, help us understand anything about, in parentheses, internet media today?
This is like the late night infomercial. It slices, but wait, there's more. I mean, the book is about the American Revolution. So in a very literal way, no, of course not. It's about the American Revolution in the 18th century. But it does provide some hints towards some of the things that are happening today, which I see as a sort of reversion towards the late 18th, early 19th century form of media, where we had been before World War II, but certainly from World War II to about 20 years ago, the second half of the 20th century, we'd been in a very corporate, very streamlined model of news as objective. It's the New York Times, it's Walter Cronkite, Tom Brokaw, whatever, as sort of these authoritative voices and relatively few dominating the conversation. And we're now reverting back to a place where there are many, many competitors, where partisanship in the news is no longer nearly as frowned upon. There are organizations that still claim to be doing something that they would describe as objective. But lots of news organizations are either with a wink and a nudge or just explicitly adopting partisanship as their frame for seeing the world for news. It's even as, I mean, CNN, MSNBC, Fox are still by far the most important of the TV networks. The New York Times and the Washington Post are more important than most other newspapers, but things are becoming far more decentralized than they had been 20 years ago. And that looks a lot more like the 18th century and looks a lot more like the time period that I study. So yeah, I mean, it's an era where they were a little more comfortable with partisanship, even as they denied it, but they didn't think about it in terms of objectivity. That's the difference, or one of the big differences, right? The New York Times claims that it's objective. It's providing the news that's fit to print, whatever they mean by that. Franklin, John Holt, Thomas Greenleaf thought they were operating a free and open press. They weren't interested in being objective. They were interested in not having the government interfere with them and in claiming to provide a forum for debate, which is a different way of thinking about the news and doesn't require you necessarily to be propagating some objective truth.
Bria asked, were broadsides mostly in major cities or published locally, or did networks distribute them to a larger area?
All of the above is the answer. They're printed wherever you can find a printer, because they're situational, right? So there's something that somebody comes in and says, I would like, a committee comes in and says, we just had a meeting and we'd like you to print this text up. Or anonymous author who wants to run a hit piece on John Jay walks in and says, I've got this text, I'd like to run it off. So they're used for local distribution in the sense that the audience in the place that has it is the one that's reading it, but they are sometimes, they are certainly sometimes circulated from city to city. And again, it's all situational. So that John Jay one, I don't have any evidence either way. I don't know if the if the Institute does on how that particular copy was used. Actually, the copy that that you took a picture of has not been handled very much at all. Unless there's been a lot of conservation work done on it, Patrick, which I don't know. Yeah, and that particular copy that I showed you in the slides, that has barely been touched. That's in incredibly good shape. The first one I showed you where there were the little, you see the little wax marks, right? That's been used a little bit. But so they could certainly send them around, right? If somebody in New York City was operating a statewide campaign and they had their printer take care of it, they could send copies to up the Hudson line, up west, up into Ulster County, up into places that aren't along the Hudson River. So yeah, they can do all of that. And it's all situational. It just depends on what the broadside's about and what it's for.
Well, thank you. It looks like that is the last question that I have in the chat box. So we're a few minutes after 8. So if anybody has any last minute questions, please feel free to type them into the box. Dr. Adelman, I want to thank you so much for your presentation tonight. Thank you for being a part of our program related to the DeWitt Clinton broadside exhibition that's on display. Once again, I'd also like to plug anybody who's also interested in this topic. Please join us again next Thursday for Dr. Haberman's talk. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight, and enjoy the rest of your evening. So thank you, everybody, and I'm going to give you a
Thank you
virtual
all.
round of applause. Thank you so much, and everybody enjoy the rest of your evening.